Hello there, Dr. Jamie. How are you?
I'm well, Megan. Thanks for having us. I'm doing well this morning.
So excited to have you here. This is going to be wonderful. So let's start with just a quick intro so that people who maybe haven't heard of your work or know who you are kind of know what they're getting into with this interview today.
Professionally, we're Dr. Jamie Marich. We are a trainer in trauma related modalities, especially EMDR therapy. We also are considered an expert in the field of addiction, dissociation, trauma, of course. And we've written about 15 different books and manuals. Have academic training as a PhD and whatnot. That's the professional side. On the personal side, we like to say just Jamie. And we're somebody with lived experience of dissociative identities, somebody with lived experience of trauma and addiction. And for a lot of years in my professional development, as I was establishing myself, there was this unspoken pressure to not talk about the personal too much, to be considered credible professionally. And at a certain point, that just felt like nonsense. And as our life and our healing continued to go and grow more towards a path of authenticity, we decided to come fully out about our lived experience with dissociative identities. And so we are happy to answer any questions personally and professionally. The book we're probably most known for in this field is Dissociation Made Simple, which came out in 2023. I think that's what caused you to invite us. And as I set in the tone of that book, I'm happy to speak both personally and professionally on this topic.
Yes. Okay. So for anybody watching or listening, we will talk about what dissociation is if you're kind of like, wait, what? But
Yeah,
this
yeah.
book, Dissociation Made Simple, I'm literally not even done with it yet, and it's probably one of the best books I'm going to read this year. And I'm so excited because I love the way that you built it. Like as someone who just wrote a book myself, like I love that it's so highly researched. You interviewed so many people, and at the same time, it's like personal and it's really about lived experience as well. And the expressive art exercises were so helpful. It's such a unique book in that it like integrates so many pathways for healing into one book, which I don't know. I'm a fan. I really enjoy it.
Thank you for appreciating that because there are a lot of people out there and more academic establishments who don't see the kind of interviews that I did that were more lived experience based as pure research
Mm.
because it wasn't taken through. I mean, I have a lot to say about that because I used a lot of established techniques to conduct my interviews. And I also made the distinction that I wasn't going to divorce myself from looking at the interviews. And even in a lot of forms of qualitative research, there's this expectation that you are supposed to take yourself completely out of the process when you interview about lived experience. And as a colleague and friend of mine said, well, that sounds like dissociation to take yourself out of it. So I really see the book as the hallmark of what my work is about is yes, we can have both professional standards and do research, yet also bring our humanity into it. Because if we separate or dissociate our humanity from this work, I think it will only go so far.
And it feels, could just be me. I'm not an academic, but it feels a little disingenuous as well. Like, I mean, you can't fully divorce yourself from anything. That's your perception of what's happening is inherent to your reporting of it, you know?
That's our feeling about it. And that's why we identify very much as a recovering academic who knew that it would be soul suffering for us if we tried to stay afloat in that world, because a
Mm.
lot of it is keeping your real self zipped up. At least that was our experience. And it just, yeah, like we write about in the book, we literally went running from our first PhD program. That's not an exaggeration. It was such this sense of, you are not safe here. How you think isn't safe here. You got to get out of here. And it's what we've done.
Yeah. Well, I'm glad because everything you've created has been really, really helpful, at least for me, and I know for a lot of other people.
Thank you for that.
Um, yeah. So, okay, let's backpedal just a little bit. For people
Sure.
who aren't as familiar with dissociation, I know it's a really big question to say, like, what's dissociation? But could you give us like a primer?
Yeah. For me to answer this question in the most simple way, we have to go to what the word means. I started as an English teacher, so there's still a lot of that English teacher soul in me. So the English word dissociation comes from a Latin word dissociatio, which means to sever or to divide. So anybody who's listening, I just ask you to sit with that simple definition, to sever or to divide. So then we can take the discussion really into the question, well, what is it we're severing or dividing from? And this is where it can get tricky because even in the psychology field, dissociation can have two meanings. It could mean that severing or dividing from the present moment in a way that every human being has done at one time or another in their life, whether that be through daydreaming, zoning out, getting so lost in your phone to distract you from what's going on around you. Talk about the highway hypnosis phenomenon. That dissociation can be severing from the present moment, whether the present moment is painful, boring, tedious, a struggle. There's a lot of reasons why our mind may want to go somewhere else. The other side of dissociation, and what can cause a little more difficulty to understand, is this idea of severing of parts or aspects of self. And so the common association here when we discuss this is dissociative identity disorder, formerly multiple personality disorder, that separate selves can literally develop or split off. And we can talk about that if you're interested, but I want to normalize it even further. That when we think of the phenomenon of people maybe being too up in their head, they're so connected to their thoughts and their logic because that's where they feel safety. And they are disconnected, or dare I say, dissociated from their body, their feelings. That is also dissociation. So when we talk about the splitting of selves or the severing or dividing of selves, it can be that simple mind, body, spirit cutoff. If those selves are not communicating with each other, that is a form of dissociation. Yet a lot of us do have separate and distinct parts. And I know one of the things we'll be talking about is in the psychology profession, there is a lot of understanding now that everybody can have parts, whether you have a dissociative disorder or not. So yeah, if you ever referred to yourself as having an inner child, doesn't necessarily mean you have a dissociative disorder, but that might help give you a basis of understanding for what people with dissociative disorders experience.
Hmm. So this is reminding me a little bit of like structural dissociation, which I know in your book you talk about like, yeah, it can be helpful. There's also aspects of it that are unhelpful.
Right.
And I'd love to hear more of your thoughts on that. But it makes me think that like primary dissociation is sort of like that severing of like an individual memory where it's like, no, 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 we can't. And that happens with like PTSD a lot. And then like secondary is more like what you were saying, that dissociation of like intellectual self from like body and spirit and all of this. And then like the tertiary is more like even up here things are severed. And like I don't know if that resonates with you or if you have anything you wanted to say about like structural dissociation, because I'm super curious. I find it helpful, but also I understand that it's not maybe not robust enough to explain things.
Well, I'll go there.
Yeah, please.
For a lot of years, and this word says a lot, I adhered to
Hmm.
theory of structural dissociation because that's what I thought I was supposed to do. Especially in the EMDR world, structural dissociation was very much amplified as the theory for understanding dissociation. And yeah, for the academic in me, it makes a certain amount of sense. Especially trying to explain this often hard to understand phenomenon to people who may not have it as part of their lived experience. And even what you described by primary, secondary, tertiary, it does give some form of model to this notion that many of us believe, which is that dissociation can be a continuum phenomenon or a spectrum phenomenon, that we can all experience that primary dissociation, but not everybody kind of has that intensity of tertiary dissociation, using the words of that model. Um, then I started looking at things a little critically. I never, even when I was adhering to structural dissociation, liked the terminology ANP, apparently normal part. I just think that's very misguided language. And even Janina Fisher has updated it to getting on with normal life part. But again, this word normal to me is just a problematic word, because what is normal really? Is that something that is subjective? Is that a value judgment if a bunch of academics are telling us what a normal part is? So I've never really liked that language of ANP. That's one of my problems with structural dissociation. I mean, you can look into this online, and I can certainly provide you with the resource too, Megan. But one of the architects of the structural dissociation theory, Onno van der Hart, has since lost his license, and there's just been a lot of um, credible claims documented of behaviors against, or actions against, that he committed against folks. And when I read that news, it just kind of didn't surprise me because I've long struggled with some of how the leaders of the field can be elevated to, well, they know best, they're experts, but are they really, especially in describing us? So especially when I found out that news, and to hear how so many people in the field still really venerate structural dissociation theory, it just very much concerns me. And then I think the third and most substantial problem I have with it is teaching it, especially, or referencing it, and hearing a lot of people adhere to it in the EMDR community. I'm not saying everybody who follows structural dissociation does this, but a lot do. And this is what's put a bad taste in my mouth about it. This sense of like the ANP is better than the EPs somehow. And you shouldn't talk to the parts directly. You shouldn't do what in IFS would be called direct access. Like, you shouldn't talk to parts directly. That work with the ANP, work with the adult self. But even then, I would say in DID, there could be several ANPs. So what is it really? And the more and more I heard this from a lot of structural dissociation leaders about not indulging the dissociation or not talking to the parts directly, that's really where it turned me off.
The word indulge in the field of psychology makes
Right.
me physically ill. As someone who struggles with obsession, I've been told don't indulge the
Sure.
obsession, don't indulge the
Yeah.
rumination.
Mm-hmm.
Um, as someone who struggles with dissociation, don't indulge the dissociation. And it's like, um, it's not indulgence if it's existing. Like, my
Thank you.
existence is not indulgent.
Thank you. And I think some of it comes from old school psychology, like don't feed the wolf or whatever, don't feed the problem. But then that goes to, is dissociation really a problem?
Mm-hmm. Depends on the context you're in,
Mhm.
I think, for a lot of us. Like, not to, get too personal or whatever, but my dissociation growing up was hugely a survival mechanism. It was like,
Sure.
okay, my emotions aren't safe. We're just gonna put those in a little box away forever.
Mhm.
And the way I describe going to college, what that was like for me is, before I went to college, I was like a grease fire, but I was within a
Oh,
pot with the lid on, right?
yeah.
And so it was like it was managed. I went to college and we took the lid off and then dumped the grease out. And I was like, what do I do? I've got no structure, which was helpful. I've got no dissociation, which was helpful. Like,
Mhm.
all of my skills went away. So it's like I'm just like an open flame now. So yeah, I think for sure. And something that sort of struck me while you were talking about the issues with structural dissociation is, like, you mentioned that we all have parts, or at least a lot of us, most of us can identify as having parts that could be tertiary. So instead of it being from like mild to severe, it's much more of like, well, here are different forms and like they can go to different depths, I guess.
Right. Uh, you may have noticed as I was sipping my mug, I have a sticker which is connected to one of the chapters of the book, Dissociation is Not a Dirty Word. And something I've tried to do with my work is to sever, if you will, this idea that dissociation is always a bad symptom, for using that value judgment of bad. Now, can dissociation be problematic? Yes. Can it put us in danger? Yes. Can it put other people in danger? Yes. I'm not here to negate that. Yet, you've mentioned very accurately, for a lot of us growing up, dissociation was a survival tactic. It's the reason we're still alive. And learning how to leverage it usefully. I mean, how did most of us get through the pandemic or any kind of upheaval? That dissociation can still be very helpful. So I've really tried to get people out of thinking of dissociation in terms of like good or bad. In EMDR therapy, we might use the language of adaptive versus maladaptive. And even that has come up in some of the general dissociation literature as well, this phrase maladaptive daydreaming. But even some folks I study with have taken it a step further and have said maybe we just call it helpful and less helpful. And even that is more of a continuum. Because, yeah, what is helpful for me in terms of leveraging dissociative skills may be not so helpful for you. And so I think as clinicians, that's part of the work we have to do is to help people do a bit of self-evaluation or selves evaluation on when is my dissociation causing me and my system problems versus when is it actually helping me keep my shit together, so to speak. And the other thing that this has come up as a criticism over the years, because Pierre Genet, who coined the term dissociation as a psychology construct, a lot of people have looked at that Genet kind of definition and have said, well, which is it? Is it the dissociating to kind of zone out, or is it the parts idea? And yes, it's both. And you could see the parallel when you understand that it means to sever or to divide. But another misconception that myself and a lot of my colleagues with lived experience are really trying to correct out there is that if somebody is in a part, if they're acting from a part that is not the adult self, especially in therapy, that they're somehow not present. Because we sometimes equate, well, dissociation is the opposite of presence. It's the opposite of mindfulness. Yet I really want people to understand that for some of us, having a part take over or acting primarily from one particular part is what helps us to stay present, especially in a difficult situation. Because a thing I've had to correct a lot of EMDR therapists with is, well, they're not present, so they can't do therapy. Well, what's the evidence that they're not present? Well, because they're in their child part. Well, that child part is very present.
Right.
And them being primarily in that child part may be what is helping them right now in this moment. So I think so much of anything, or more than anything, my work is about trying to help us take our value judgments off of dissociation. And that's one of the reasons I decided to come out very fully as being a person with dissociative disorders. We were diagnosed in 2004. We didn't have our full coming out till 2018. And one of the reasons we did when we did is we just kind of got sick of hearing dissociation spoken about in terms that were very pejorative, in terms that were it is this thing you can't, I often say the most ridiculous thing I ever heard an EMDR trainer say is don't let your clients dissociate. So my answer to that is you're not that powerful.
No.
No one is that powerful. A person's going to dissociate if they need to dissociate, if they're overwhelmed. And what if we could learn to roll with it and work with it instead of being so afraid of it?
And what you were saying about like, oh, well, if they're not present because their child part is out or this part is out or whatever, like that feels very, it reminds me of the ANP, like those parts aren't real. Like they also probably need therapy and need help. Like it's okay for them to be the one that's present, or at least, I don't know. Yeah.
And I think another thing, there were many things that really kind of turned me off to structural dissociation. But at one point, I heard a major teacher in the model essentially roll her eyes at what EPs will do. And it's like, that's not cool to me. Because some of my most creative impulses are born in those emotional parts. Some of the things that still serve me in my life and my career come from those emotional parts. So, and I'm an OSDD system. I am somebody who's never been diagnosed with what is full scale DSM, DID. In the ICD, we would definitely qualify as partial DID. So as an OSDD system, yeah, you're talking to an ANP right now using that language, essentially an ANP who could shapeshift a bit between Dr. Jamie and Jamie, but our other three major parts would be considered EPs. And so when we hear EP spoken about in that way, I think after a while it just got to us and we decided it's time to come out.
Yeah. Yeah, I can completely understand why that would just not feel safe, right? After a
Right.
certain point. It would just be like, okay, either I am putting parts of myself to death again in
Mhm.
order to fit here, or I have to choose me, and
Yes.
goodness,
And
thank goodness you did.
oh, thank you. And there's a story I tell in Dissociation Made Simple that I think tells it all that in 2006, circa 2006, when I was first getting trained in EMDR therapy, and there was a special topics presenter on dissociation who was speaking about it and using a lot of this language that we're using here. And I was sitting back, and my first impulse was, she is making this way harder than it needs to be. But call this a fawn response, call it a survival response. After the workshop, we went up to her and just thanked her for her work and for helping us to understand. Because a lot of what was going through our minds at that point was, we're the sick one. She's the
Mhm.
professional. We're the one who was afflicted by this. And so I think we likely overdid it with some of our training early in our career in terms of taking training and trying to get knowledgeable because there was still some shame we were carrying about even having the diagnosis. And then over the years, as I sat and listened and got more and more frustrated while also getting more and more educated, I knew I had to come out.
Mhm. That is something that's like at the risk of sounding a little arrogant. Hopefully, this doesn't come off that way, but that's something I've
Oh,
also struggled with, this idea of like I'm trying to learn and I want to learn, but it's like you said, it literally feels like they're making it too hard in an attempt to pathologize it. Like the pathology is getting in the way of their understanding.
so the one thing I will say in defense of them, because
Sure.
I do, for the record, I do appreciate this, that the need to put a model on it and what a lot of us see as pathologize it and research it empirically is to give the construct of dissociation some legitimacy in the larger scientific community. And that is important work, especially when a lot of other facets of the field, a lot of people in the scientific community still don't see dissociation as a real thing.
Mhm.
So I really applaud the people who have legitimized this academically. My problem is when they're the ones teaching therapists how to do therapy, or if
Right.
they're the
Academic
ones,
research and therapy are so different.
yeah, or if they're the ones working with clients. And now part of my understanding of structural dissociation or how I see it is and this is going to sound a little full of myself and arrogant, but it's an attempt by what we sometimes call like singletons or non-system people to try to explain dissociation to other therapists who are not systems. And I think if you can appreciate it as that, if it helps therapists who aren't systems themselves to be able to better understand this, great. But if you ask me as a person with lived experience what I think about it, I'm going to tell you now what I really think about it.
Yeah. I think I really relate to that in the world of like autism, because I'm diagnosed as autistic, and there are a lot of resources out there for non-autistic people to understand autism, which is needed. Like you said, like it's important, but like if you're gonna ask me about it, like no, that's not how any of this works.
Yeah, and sometimes I'll hear people say things like, "Well, we need more research in this area," and our cheeky response from that part is, "Do we really need more research, or do we just need more bridges of understanding in between people?"
Mhm.
And as somebody who started my career in humanitarian aid and in the arts, I think that's naturally the way I see the world more.
Mm.
And I know that there are other people who are more math and science minded that might need something a little more structured. So I think all of it is helpful and all of it can contribute to the understanding. Yet at the end of the day, I really adhere to the advice from Kurt Rounzen, who's one of the people I interviewed in the book. He was an early somebody I consider a mentor, role model in the EMDR community, who said, if you want to be a good therapist, listen to your clients with DID. Like find a client with DID, those are his words, and really listen to them. And I feel there's so much to be said in that guidance.
Yeah. Yes, for sure. So I have one question that's sort of a switch in topic, but it's related to what we've been talking about. So you mentioned, like everybody kind of has parts and stuff, but not everybody is like has a
Mm-hmm.
dissociative disorder. I'm
Right.
wondering where that line is. Is there a line? Like, for those of us who are like, okay, I have parts and they're pretty loud, but I don't know.
It's a good question. I mean, and a lot of it depends on who you ask. If
Sure.
you ask Western science and Western psychology, get out of DSM and read the criteria for DID or OSDD. And technically, by those standards, what makes something a disorder is it causing functional impairment? Is it
Mhm.
getting in the way of your life? Especially these people with DID experience this a lot, these amnesia blocks between the parts not remembering, the parts not being able to communicate. And that can be what cause a lot of distress for sure. For most people I've met out there who talk in the language of parts and refer to their internal system of parts, but don't necessarily have the disorder, they're not dealing with things like losing consciousness between the parts, for instance. I mean, and I know this explanation doesn't land with everybody, but when I'm asked, like, well, what's the difference between somebody saying, well, I have an inner child that feels very loud right now versus what I might experience as a system, an OSDD system or a DID system, my inner child is a lot more real to me
Hmm.
than
Okay.
how I hear people talk about parts in general, like from more of an IFS model or this idea that we all have parts or aspects of self. Um, I mean, my parts are so real to me that I take real issue if somebody calls them an imaginary friend,
Ooh.
which has been said pejoratively by another leader in the field. I take issue if somebody says, well, you have to integrate them in order to be well. And that's, a hot button issue in the field. Do you have to have integration amongst the parts in order to alleviate the diagnosis? And that goes to the debate of how are you defining integration? Because most people with a DID system who are not operating from a place of shame will have serious feelings about one or more of the parts possibly being eradicated
Mm.
because there can be a lot of attachment to them. And so a lot of us, and you can probably tell this by listening to me, embrace more of this path of functional multiplicity or cooperation amongst the parts. And
Mhm.
you can still be well if you do that. I actually think it's a more authentic way to be well. But if somebody does want to work towards more classic integration, that's their right. I just tell therapists don't force it on people and perpetuate this myth that you have to integrate and turn we into I in order
Right.
for wellness to happen or symptoms to alleviate.
Yeah, so all the parts don't have to live in the living room together. They can be in their separate rooms, but maybe we just like unlock the doors.
Yeah, that's a good way to look at it. Although I think some models of integration are as cruel as let's kick those parts out of the house.
But see, that's not integration, that's
Yeah,
deportation.
that would be deportation. Or how do we like melt everybody down into one?
Mm.
It's like, I think of when I was a kid and I was fed this lie in school that America is a great melting pot. And what is meant by the melting pot to a lot of people is that, we come from all these nations of the world, we're melted down. And what emerges is this alloy of an ideal American. Now,
Mm.
some people want that, could read between the lines and know what I mean about that in the current climate. But many others have proposed that a better metaphor instead of the melting pot is maybe it's a pot of stew or it's a salad
Mhm.
where the different ingredients work together to make beautiful flavor. And for me, that is the kind of wellness I've worked towards in my system. And that for me feels like a more kinder, more authentic way for to lead people.
Yeah, and if it helps, that is actually the metaphor I learned, not in elementary school. Elementary school, we learned the melting pot, but by high
Right.
school, they were teaching the salad method. So
Salad. Yeah.
yeah, that is where it was emerging, at least for a while there. Um,
Yeah.
yeah. Okay. I think last main question I had was if, anybody's watching and they're either, they know they're a system or they're like, ooh, this is hitting. What's
Yeah.
like something you would want them to know?
Yeah. Great question. I think my answer is two part. One part would be if you're already in therapy, and the other part would be if you're thinking of pursuing therapy. If you're already in therapy and you bring it up with the therapist and they shut it down and that feels gross to you, honor that
Mm.
because it could be they're not the best fit for you, at least right now, to be exploring what is emerging for you. If you're thinking that getting into therapy can be helpful, definitely ask these questions. And I give you guide questions in Dissociation Made Simple that you can ask therapists or psychiatrists to trust who you're safe with to explore this. Because I'm hesitant to give like blanket medical advice, or I'll just what do you call it? Disclaimer this by saying this is not meant to be interpreted as individual or medical advice for you, but I will just say in general, um, if you're suspecting you're a system and you feel you can safely start to explore some of that, there's a lot of ways you can do that. I was just speaking with somebody the other day, and as a musician, as somebody who really likes music, making music and listening to music, something you could consider doing is making a playlist that describes each of your parts that you're kind of tapping into. What songs do they really connect with? Maybe what songs help them cope? And listening to those playlists then together might be a way to start promoting some of that cooperation. I like doing a lot of what I call parts journaling. The reason I'm disclaiming this is this may not feel safe for you to do without therapeutic guidance. So if that is you, I would ask your therapist or your would-be therapist if this feels like a good fit. But I like to do a lot of, this is what my adult part is feeling today. And then I let the parts respond to what the adult part says. Or if a part is particularly loud that day, or we're feeling a little dysregulated or disheveled that day, we'll write as if we're writing the scene of the play, how the parts are interacting with each other, trying to come up with some kind of solution for at least getting through the day. If you're an artist, a lot of people with dissociative systems respond well to visual art. You can see I have art on the walls behind me, and it's just a great exploratory mechanism for being curious about how different parts and their stories may show up on the page or on the canvas.
And I think it's super interesting that you bring up both music and visual art because I think, especially the art that you have behind you, there are so many colors,
Mm-hmm.
but it's not brown. It's not, we didn't melt them
Yeah.
together. They exist on their own. And the same thing happens with music.
Mm-hmm.
Every chord is built of individual notes. And I think
Mm-hmm.
that really speaks to the dissociative experience in a really like meaningful way. So,
Great way. Every chord is built of individual notes, and every song is built of a series of chords and notes. So it's a
yeah.
wonderful to look at it. A metaphor a lot of dissociative systems will also use is different instruments in an orchestra or different members of a band, different voices in a choir.
Mm.
That all works.
Yeah. I love it. I'm a very metaphor person, so that helps.
So am I. So are we.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for your time, for sharing your expertise, both through lived experience and all of the work that you've done. I don't know, is there anything else? Do you want to let people know where they can follow you? That's a big one.
Yeah, thank you. This was delightful. These were wonderful questions. I enjoyed the conversation. So you can search myname.com. That's my general website, and it connects you to a lot of my different projects, my social media links. Uh, to my understanding, I'm the only real Jamie Marich that's out there. So if you Google us, you'll find us, whether that be on the socials or our website. Two websites I would want to shout out as well. Redefinetherapy.com is my resources site. So everything that I've done for free is available on that site. Different videos, different podcasts, different articles, etc. And then my company, Institute for Creative Mindfulness, does EMDR trainings for professional clinicians. So if you're a clinician interested in training, that would be the website I'd recommend. And then here on YouTube, we're Dr. Jamie MM.
All right. I have all of that written down. All of that will be in the show notes, everybody, or show notes description, you know.
Right.
Um, well, thank you so, so much for your time. And I hope everybody enjoyed.